Joining us on World Now to discuss these developments is a professor of peace and conflict resolution at the Queen's University, Darren Q. He joins us from Belfast in Northern Ireland. Thank you for joining us on World Now. Well, fighting has actually continued in Gaza despite the resolution by the UN Security Council for a ceasefire on Monday. Do you see these hostilities abate anytime soon?
Thank you for having me. And no, I don't see the hostilities are going to abate anytime soon. I mean, I think the resolution at the UN Security Council is certainly a diplomatic setback for Israel, and it underscores the growing distance between Washington and Israel at this point in time, particularly between the Netanyahu government and the Biden administration. But I think that the Netanyahu government is still seeing this as its opportunity to beat back Hamas, or perhaps to cripple it semi-permanently. Even though I'm not sure the evidence is supporting that, but I think that that's what the plan is. And I do think that the Netanyahu government is going to continue with its offensive, and it's going to try its best to try to beat back Hamas and to cripple it as much as possible.
Indeed, Israel insists it will not surrender to what it calls Hamas's delusional ceasefire demands. But what does this mean for the millions that are still stuck in Gaza?
I fear this means that the suffering is only going to continue, and I think that the Israeli offensive, by all signs, is going to push more and more refugees towards the Egyptian border and is going to push them between a rock and a hard place. And we're already seeing reports that Gaza is reaching a famine-like situation. There are additional reports that the Israelis have been slowing up aid convoys to reaching the refugees. So this situation is only going to get worse as Israel ups its offensive.
But what more do you think can be done? Because it does appear the talks are not achieving the desired result of a truce.
I do think that the Biden administration has put quite a bit of additional pressure on Israel. I don't think at this point much of any sort of pressure is going to get the Israelis' attention unless the Americans threaten to hold off military support for Israel, which is something that the Americans have so far, not at least publicly, been willing to do. I think if the Israelis continue in this direction, I think that's the next card that Washington is going to play. That will probably be done quietly if it hasn't been done already. And the big question is whether the Biden administration is willing to do that. You can be sure that the Netanyahu administration would make that threat public in a way to try to create pressure on the Biden administration to back off. There's probably quite a bit going back and forth now in that direction. I think something else that could help the situation is I think it's time for Arab governments to condemn the initial Hamas attack in the first place. I think that Israel at this point certainly feels alone, and it feels that it is misunderstood and that there has been no condemnation outside of the United States of the Hamas attack since October. I think if regional powers are willing to say, yes, what Hamas did initially was wrong, but that does not legitimate what the Israelis have done, some sort of tit-for-tat diplomatic arrangement can help to at least give the Israelis some sort of face-saving way to back off on this offensive. Though I fear that even that may not necessarily change the Netanyahu government at this point in time and their goals of trying to cripple Hamas.
You know, there's been real questions as to what really can get Prime Minister Netanyahu to have a change of mind. Because the U.S. abstained from the vote, the UN Security Council vote on Monday, already we know that Israel rather, canceled diplomatic visits to the U.S. already. So just imagine what could happen in the days ahead. But let's talk about humanitarian aid. About 12 people are said to have drowned and 6 killed in stampedes trying to reach airdropped food packages. What options are available for those who are still in Gaza who need to get respite?
Yeah, I fear that the options are extremely limited for them and that the picture is only going to get worse. The Israelis really have a chokehold on humanitarian access to most of the civilian populated areas at this point. The big question is whether the Israelis are going to allow that to happen. The Israelis have been saying, and not without reason, that Hamas leadership has been hiding in the hospitals and in other civilian refugee locations. So consequently, the Israelis, if they're going to move forward with their offensive, are going to be going in exactly the areas where you have the greatest humanitarian need. So I think that this is only going to be a darkening picture. I think that there's some possibilities still for some negotiations to maybe to try to get this to slow up. But as I said earlier, I fear that that window is closing.
And we know that the UN rapporteur for Palestine believes that the threshold for genocidal acts, have been reached by Israel in Gaza. What is the implication of this?
Well, I think that's going to be an intense international legal conversation over what exactly of the Genocide Convention does apply here. And certainly the World Court is going to weigh on this at some point. I suspect that this conversation is going to quickly shift to a conversation over war crimes, which has a much lower threshold under international law to try to prove compared to the genocide accusations. So I think we're going to see a lot more conversation about war crimes that the Israelis are committing in Gaza. And you can be sure that Israel is going to talk about the war crimes that Hamas has undertaken against Israel. And we're going to see that conversation playing out in the months and I suspect the years to come.
I really do wish that we can put a date really to when all of this would end and that Gazans can go about their businesses without any fear. I mean, can you do something like that?
I can't put a date on it, certainly. I mean, I suppose the one slim hope out of the action at the Security Council at this point is that I believe it is probably going to push the Israelis to accelerate their offensive and to try to get it over as soon as possible. I fear that that means that that's going to actually increase the number of casualties, but perhaps it means that we're going to get to some sort of ceasefire sooner rather than later. But the interim between that point is certainly going to be intense and brutal, and I just hope that it's over as soon as possible.
Thank you very much. Professor of Peace and Conflict Resolution at the Queen's University, Darren Q. Thank you for talking to us on World Now.
Thank you for having me.